Hayward. I'm your fearless lake coordinator. I'm originally from New Hampshire, and I was born and grew up there, and then went to college in George Washington University, Washington, D.C., and came here, so kept moving south.
My name is Maria Elena, and I grew up in Puerto Rico, but I went to school in Connecticut, where actually my mother's family lives. My dad was Boricua, and I have lived in Atlanta since 1976.
And when I came here, in different capacities as a gay person, and also in the civil rights movement, to begin to engage how so many areas that the city was about had to do with GLBT people were in every capacity in the city, even, obviously, when I tell them, in the City of Atlanta government. It can be done. You know, we talk about City Hall here. I think that
Abby is the first out person at City Hall, right?
Pretty much.
that I know of.
Pretty much.
Abby's a national treasure.
I'm originally from New York City, Astoria, Queens. Everyone knows New York. I ended up down in Georgia, in Atlanta, because after graduating from college, I decided to go into VISTA, part of the War on Poverty, Volunteers in Service to America. It's kind of like a domestic Peace Corps, was the idea. And I got sent to Atlanta to be trained and actually ended up working in Atlanta. So I loved Atlanta. I got to know people here. I loved the city and I loved Atlanta, so I ended up moving here. Already I had been involved in anti-war, anti-Vietnam War stuff, and in the left movement, basically, anti-capitalism, socialism, that kind of thing. And feminism was becoming something which made me realize there's something I really should be looking at because of who I am. And it was here that I came out in 1971, I think it was, that I actually came out. And in 72, then got together with a bunch of other kind of social justice-minded, radical lesbian women who were either coming from civil rights, anti-war, left movements who had it with the sexism in those movements, and women who were from Gay Liberation Front who also were dealing with that same issue, decided to get together and form a lesbian feminist organization, Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance, or ALPHA. So I'm one of the founding people in that organization. So my social justice involvement has been kind of with lots of different issues.
Because they're all related.
Yeah, I mean, we call it intersectional now, but we always felt like that. The women who formed Alpha were very much from all these different movements. Some of them have just been to the Venceremos Brigade in Cuba, which was a support network, trips to Cuba that were organized to help with sugarcane harvesting and farming in their growing, revolutionary economy. So that was a kind of connection of all kinds of issues that was happening back then, from sexual liberation to ending racial discrimination and racism, white supremacy, to the women's movement and feminism. It all seemed very connected. That's how people saw the world back then, as the interconnected struggles of what's now called marginalized people, we'd call oppressed people back then, or oppressed groups of folks. And GLF was very much, you probably heard, a very intersectional kind of organization. Some of the founders were communists. So that's where I came from, and I've continued over the years of kind of connecting with various movements and supporting those movements.
I realized I was gay when I was about 15 or so, or at least attracted to both men and women, and I never really came out to my parents because I didn't think that was a good thing to do. And the thing that's interesting to me about growing up Catholic is that I never heard direct discrimination. The priest never stood up there and said we were all going to hell. They just didn't talk about it. It was sort of tacit, you know. And I remember, I'll tell you the quick story. My grandfather, my mom's dad, was totally 1,000% Irish Catholic. And I remember we were at a picnic, and this was like probably about 1956 or 57 or something like that. And so my grandfather said to my mom and me, he said, I want to tell you the most amazing story that I've ever heard. And we said, what, Grandpa Bobby, what? And he said, well, I heard of a woman with a husband and 2 children who left her husband and her 2 children for another woman. And we went, wow. Because it was like inconceivable. It was like, I mean, this is like, we're talking in the 50s. It's like, is that even possible? I mean, do people do that? I mean, and I got to give my grandfather credit because he didn't really express any prejudice. It was just astonishment.
When I was like 18, 19, 20, and beginning to come into a consciousness about being queer, I said, wow, now here's a whole area where I also have to pick up and do some lifting. And I started being very public in what I was doing, making speeches and writing things. And my parents would come up to the States and we would have dinner together. And they would ask me, are you seeing anyone? And I'd say yes. And that's it. Because they knew, you know. And finally, they moved here. They moved to Jonesboro. And I already had a public profile. You know, I'd been in the newspaper and stuff like that. And I said, oh my God, I've got to officially come out because I wanted to pick up the paper. And actually, years later, my mother would call me and say, oh, see, you're in the paper again. Yeah. But, so my experience was different. And I also had to struggle with, well, is my father going to say, I have no daughter, you know, because that happens in families. Fortunately, he did not, you know. He decided he would love me anyways. But that was a process, you know.
Good choice.
And I started working for MARTA in 1978. And actually, I'd worked for the city of Atlanta before as their first woman mechanic. And
That was big, let me tell you. We knew one another in those days together. We were all in the city of Atlanta in different ways.
yeah, really, there were 26 lesbians. We just like had magnifying glasses and pretended there were more. But anyhow, and
Or just share.
so while I was still working for the city of Atlanta, which I started working there in 76, 77. Yeah, 77. And then right into 78, I gave this speech that was covered because Anita Bryant was a very hot story at the time.
People know Anita Bryant.
If you don't, let's just say who Anita Bryant.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Tell 'em.
So Anita Bryant was
Satan incarnate.
She was the spokeswoman for the Florida citrus, the orange, and she had this big come to the Florida sunshine tree, best tasting orange juice naturally. So anyway, she also had been a runner-up to Miss America and had a big career as a singer and stuff like that in the 60s. So she ended up being the spokeswoman for the Florida citrus group. And then apparently, from what I understand, it was her husband, Bob Green, I think was his name, who said, we really need to fight against, you know, these homosexuals. So through the 70s, that was since the Stonewall riot, there were resolutions that were passed in many cities that gave us basic rights in terms of equal access to housing and accommodations and non-discrimination. And they were all city ordinances. I don't think very many states had them. They were trying to pass a resolution like that in Miami-Dade County. And she and her group together, and you know, the thing that I like to point out about this is that our our enemies always use the same tactics. So the organization that they chose to call themselves was Save Our Children. Save Our Children, like SOS. So it was kind of like, how are children going to be jeopardized if LGBTQ people have equal access to housing? I don't know. Anyway, what they did succeed in doing, this was like, I think the end of '77, was repealing the Miami-Dade County ordinance that gave us just, you know, the most quotidian of rights. I mean, it was embryonic, and they repealed that. And then they went around the country and successfully repealed ordinances in several other cities. Thank you, Anita. So anyway, Anita and her minions came to Atlanta in, I think it was June of '78. June of '78. Okay, and she was the special featured guest of honor at the Southern Baptist Convention. Yay. So rather than having a pride that year, we had a massive demonstration against Anita Bryant at the Georgia World Congress Center. And something I want to point out about that was that, have people seen Selma? Anybody seen the movie Selma? Okay. So to me, that was our Selma moment, because up until then, when we had pride, we always, it was pretty much just ourselves, LGBTQ people. And people realized that what Anita was doing was against everyone's rights. I mean, if they can single us, they can single out anybody. So what was great about that march, rather than having a pride that year, we had a massive march on the Georgia World Congress Center, and a lot of straight people joined us for the first time. Which was, so I say that was like our, and I say Selma because the first march in Selma on the bridge in '65, the police beat like John Lewis had his skull fractured and that kind of thing. Yes.
By the way, whenever you go to a demo, think about bringing maxi pads. And the reason why I say that is because if you have a head wound, it bleeds profusely, and so you could absorb some of the blood before the EMTs get there. It's just something I learned over the years. Okay.
You got that, guys?
But anyhow, hey, you
I
know,
love her. We're like,
Use you can use.
he's brought the crime.
I call it hints from hell, Louise. But
We had a choreographed dance of move and shake at 12 different shakers and movers.
you know, I spoke at that demo, and like I said, it was a hot story.
So what I want to say, give props to Maria. So Maria came and got to the podium and said, "I come to you today as a defiant dyke." And we had a massive, it was about 10 to 15 minutes, we went berserk. We just were screaming and yelling and hooting and hollering, and it was a great moment.
Well, you know, I had to go to work the next day.
Something else I want to bring out about Anita Bryant is that, as I said, rather than having a pride that year, we had a demonstration against Anita Bryant in the Southern Baptist Convention. And we raised so much money doing that demonstration that we finally had enough money to have an Atlanta Gay and Lesbian Center. So that actually means that Anita was the de facto founder of Atlanta Gay and Lesbian Center. So it's very important to see those silver linings and those ironies of story. So.